Sup guys? Many of you watching this right now are probably not aware, but the second video that I ever did with speaking was on the ship Independence, right after her retrofit in the New Jersey event over 3.5 years ago. Even though the editing and the delivery left a lot to be desired at the time, I have to admit, even back then I was spitting straight fire. I thought that I'd make an update 3.5 years later because she is one of the rare non-URs that I have in the S tier of my tier list. By the way, I don't even remember moving Unicorn to the first spot. There must have been a bug with the ordering, but it doesn't really matter much since she's not directly comparable with the other carriers anyway. Back to Independence, not only did she outlast the other gold light carriers that were OP at the time, but even New Jersey, the strongest ship in the game at the time of their simultaneous release. I will be discussing why it is that she has managed to find herself a spot in the meta despite the power creep, and then give you some tips on how to make the most out of her amazing kit. Let us begin with her strengths and weaknesses. Before the release of Fritz Rume, she had arguably the best interception in the game, with a loadout of 4 flapjacks at 160% efficiency, 4 wyverns at 145% efficiency, and an anti-air gun on top. Anyone who has ever used her in chapters 13 and 15 can attest to the absolutely ridiculous numbers that she ends up with, often MVPing over UR ships, and it's not because of her surface damage. She's also extremely fast, having the second highest reload stat out of all carriers and light carriers, in addition to a 10% reload buff on top, and another extra 25% cooldown reduction for the first airstrike. In fact, some players complain that she is too fast, for which there is a little bit of a remedy. Her third strength is her buff for other carriers, not only for her own fleet, but all the others as well. Carriers do not have the luxury of changing their cooldowns easily just by changing their main guns like battleships, so reload buffs are extremely useful, but also rare. Aside from the reload buff, it also gives aviation, which is just free damage and interception for all of your carriers. Her weakness comes from her relatively low stats, which is reflected both in her poor surface damage and low survivability in a vacuum. Large chunks of her skills also go unused most of the time, as there is no good USS torpedo bomber, and no meta-relevant Cleveland-class Vanguard to sortie with her at the moment. But it doesn't matter because she's still great even without all that. Putting it all together, what does this really mean in practice? First, in campaign, she is good from the moment you get her, which is as soon as you obtain enough core data and retrofit materials, all the way to chapter 15.4. Her high reload and reduced cooldown for the first strike allows her to strike at very convenient timing in a mob fleet with other conventionally good ships. Inexperienced players may fall into the trap of thinking that stacking a bunch of preloads in their fleet will lead to faster clears, but this is not true. The first wave of enemies is not that strong, and dumping a ton of damage on it will just lead to overkill, followed by a whole bunch of nothing while everything is on cooldown. There's no benefit of having 6 preloads compared to 1 or 2, which is enough to kill the first wave in all of campaign. By the way, torpedoes obviously count as preloads as well, not just airstrikes and battleship guns. On the other hand, Independence's kit naturally makes her strike between preloads and the first reload of regular main fleet ships, giving you a free way to fill in the gap between the attacks. This carries on for a few cycles until cooldowns start to overlap because she's naturally faster, but until then, she actually leads to much faster progression of the waves of enemies, unlike stacking a bunch of preloads. There are some other ships that have similar timing but hit harder, like Baron Meta and Impero, but they are much more difficult to obtain, have inferior anti-air, and do not buff your other carriers. Independence herself does enough damage in mobbing even with plus 10 planes, so I personally have found no use for the others while she exists. You can also put her in the boss fleet, which is actually what I typically do. You want to bring at least 3 carriers for airspace control anyway, and likely 2 of them will be in the mob fleet. Something like Unicorn plus Volga or Aquila or Shinano being the most popular. There is no other ship that you can put in the boss fleet that will directly buff the 2 carriers in your mob fleet like her. In chapters 12 and 13, she can be the anti-air carry for your boss fleet, and in chapter 15, it's hard to have too much anti-air. Of course, there is some concern about her survivability in chapters 14 and 15. As a main fleet ship, there are 3 ways in which she can get into trouble. First is enemy planes, for which she herself is a large part of the solution. Second is suicide ships. so make sure to sortie her with at least one battleship that will be able to intercept suicide ships if there is such a need. Third is battleship shelling. As a carrier, she is at no risk of being targeted by shelling as long as she stays concealed, and there is a battleship or another ship that is already revealed. The two ways of being revealed are incidentally enemy planes and suicide ships, both of which have been addressed, so she just ends up sitting there with her low HP pool but never in any real danger. Of course, you can go a step further and put her in the same fleet as Musashi as well to protect her, but it's not even needed. In Operation Siren, she saves you a lot of time for the same reason as I explained before, filling the hole in the main fleet strikes with her unique airstrike timing. Additionally, her cross-fleet buff is weaker there, but there's no alternative, and it now buffs 3 other fleets instead of just 1. It's not a stretch at all to say that I use her probably as much as all of the UR carriers combined, and maybe even more than Unicorn because I still use her in my boss fleet when I'm leveling ships. While the URs are much more powerful, they are all in direct competition with each other, coming out on top only in specific scenarios, but Independence bypasses all of that and finds her own place in the meta of the game. In terms of content that gives rewards, aside from exercises, her biggest weakness is going to be solo boss fights like the meta fights due to her low damage. However, she can compensate for it through her aviation and reload buffs, which may enable other carriers to get off an extra airstrike within a given time frame without sacrificing as much of their damage. With the Swordfish 818 Squadron, which slows the enemy on hit by 60% for 6 seconds, she can also function as slow support for your other main fleet ships since she naturally launches first. Here is an example on the current meta boss, Taiho. I reduced light carrier fleet tech reload to 0, which only affects her and not Shinano and Amagi, who are regular carriers. This way, she doesn't strike too early and the slow will last long enough for Shinano and Amagi's torpedo bombers to benefit from it. Reducing light carrier tech reload is the solution for her being too fast, by the way, which I mentioned earlier. Obviously, this is not a consistent setup, but I don't think there are many non-UR ships that you can replace her with and still succeed in one-shotting this boss, especially without the use of Helena. The 2 other SSR main fleet ships that I have done this with so far, with success, are Kaga and Nagato, both of whom are specific to Shinano and Amagi, but this is a proof of concept that can be applied to a medium or light armor boss fleet in the same way. If this is her biggest weakness, then I'd say she's in a pretty good spot.